In the last couple of lectures, we've been looking at the role of the auxiliaries in the verb group. We've looked at how auxiliaries play a part in indicating progressive and perfect aspect. And we've looked at the formation of passive clauses. When we looked at passive clauses, we kept it pretty simple and gave examples in which there was no aspect marked, so that we would only have to deal with one auxiliary. But of course, you can have a clause which is passive, in which the event being referred to is completed or in progress, in which case we will need to indicate the perfect or progressive aspect too. In this last grammar lecture, we will look at how to form passives from active clauses when the clause is marked for aspect. In terms of what you need to know when it comes to auxiliaries in the verb group, you need to be able to do a few things. You need to know how to identify whether there are any auxiliaries in the verb group and what role they're playing. In other words, is the clause marked for perfect aspect, progressive aspect, or passive voice? You also need to be able to form a passive clause from an active clause, making sure to keep the tense and aspect the same in the passive clause. As we've already told you, you can get up to 3 primary auxiliaries in the verb group, and they always occur in the following order if more than one occurs together. First, have, indicating perfect aspect, plus the ed-en form of what comes next, either the following auxiliary or the main verb. Second, be, indicating progressive aspect, plus the ing form of what comes next. And third, be, indicating passive voice, plus the ed-en form of the main verb. You need to learn these 3 rules. Before we go into forming passives from active sentences, which have aspect marked, I need to draw your attention to one more thing about the auxiliaries. This is another really important point. Remember that forms of be can either be a main verb, in which case be is a copula, or be is a primary auxiliary. When you see a form of be, it always has to be one or the other. Now that you know how the primary auxiliaries work in indicating aspect or passive voice, this means you know how to work out which be you've got. If a form of be is followed by a word that has ing or ed-en on it, then it's a primary auxiliary. Don't forget that some irregular verbs have a form other than the ed-en ending for the past participle, but we call it the ed-en form to avoid confusion. If a form of be is not followed by a word that has ing or ed-en on it, then it is a copula. Now on to forming passives from active clauses when you have aspect marked. If you're making a passive from an active, you start by applying the passive rule. When you get to the be part of the rule, you may have to apply one or both of the other rules because be in the passive has to be in the same tense and aspect as the verb group in the active voice sentence. Make sure you keep the tense the same as the original sentence. In the last example of the last lecture, we looked at how to make a passive clause from the active clause, the garbos collect the rubbish bins. The active clause was in the present tense and had no aspect, so forming the passive was quite straightforward. The rubbish bins are collected by the garbos. The formation of the passive gets slightly more complicated if there is aspect as well as tense in the active clause. Let's look at a similar example. The garbos are collecting the rubbish bins, which is in the present tense, but the progressive aspect this time. Again, we first move the object, the undergoer noun phrase, to the front of the clause, to the subject position. Then we change the main verb to the past participle form, the ed-en form. We then add the auxiliary be, but this time be has to be in the present progressive, because the active clause was in the present progressive, are collecting. How do we make the present progressive? By using the ing form of the verb and adding the present tense of the auxiliary be. You can see that that is what is left after we took the main verb and put it in the ed-en form. The important point to realise is that it is now the be that we are using to make the passive, the primary auxiliary, which we have to turn into the present progressive, not the main verb. We've put collected aside for the moment. We've finished doing what we need to do with that. So the ing form of be is being. Then we add the present tense of the auxiliary be, which is are, because the subject is plural. So we now have the auxiliary be in the present progressive, making the verb group are being collected. The rest of the process is the same. Move the subject, the agent NP of the active clause from the front of the clause and put it after the verb group in a prepositional phrase with by. So we end up with the rubbish bins are being collected by the garbos. Now let's try an example with the past perfect. The garbos had collected the rubbish bins is marked for past tense and perfect aspect. Again, to make this sentence passive, we first move the object, the undergoer noun phrase, to the front of the clause, to the subject position. Then we make sure the main verb is in the past participle form, the ed-en form. In this case, we don't need to change the form of the verb because it was already in that form for the perfect aspect. We then add the auxiliary be, but this time be has to be in the past perfect form because the active clause was in the past perfect, had collected. How do we make the past perfect? By using the ed-en form of the verb and adding the past tense of the auxiliary have. You can see that that's what's left after we took the main verb and put it in the ed-en form. The important point to realise is now that the be that we're using to make the passive, the primary auxiliary, which we have to turn into the past perfect, not the main verb. So the ed-en form of be is been, then we add the past tense of the auxiliary have, which is had. So we now have the auxiliary be in the past perfect, making the verb group had been collected. Again, the rest of the process is the same. Move the subject, the agent noun phrase of the active clause from the front of the clause and put it after the verb group in a prepositional phrase with by. So we have the sentence, the rubbish bins had been collected by the garbos. This may seem complicated, but the trick is to take one step at a time. First look for the main verb of the active and put that into the past participle. Then find out what the tense and aspect of the active sentence is and put the auxiliary be into that tense and aspect. It's not as hard as it looks. We've made it quite clear that you can only form a passive clause when you have a transitive verb. You can passivize a clause that is transitive, but you can't passivize a clause that is intransitive, or that has a copular verb as the main verb. This is an important point that is useful to know when you're trying to find the object noun phrase in a clause. Knowing that you can form a passive only when the clause is transitive can help you find the object of the clause in two ways. Firstly, it will help you find whether there is an object at all. Is the verb transitive or not? And secondly, it will help you work out where the object noun phrase starts and ends. Let's look at some examples to see what I mean by this. In the sentence, my friend left the next day, there is a noun phrase directly following the verb left. The fact that this is a noun phrase is pretty obvious because it starts with the article the. But is this noun phrase an object noun phrase? If it isn't an object noun phrase, then what is it? Some of you might immediately be able to say, of course it isn't an object noun phrase. It's an adverbial noun phrase. I know that because it's giving information about when my friend left. It's not what my friend left. I can also confirm my suspicion that it is an adverbial using a few other tests. I could remove the noun phrase and the sentence still makes sense. My friend left. If the noun phrase was an object, then the sentence would sound wrong if I took the noun phrase away. Also, I can move the noun phrase to the front and the sentence still looks good. The next day, my friend left. If you followed that line of thinking, you are employing three tests to work out if there is an object noun phrase in the sentence. Is the noun phrase stating when, where, how or why? Can you leave the noun phrase out? Can you move the noun phrase to the front? Those are great ways to test whether something is an object noun phrase or not. The passive test is a fourth way to help you work out whether a noun phrase is an object or not. So this involves, of course, not just moving the noun phrase to the front, but following all the steps for forming a passive. So with this example, if you could form a passive, then the passive would be, the next day was left by my friend. That's not a good sentence, is it? So there is your fourth piece of evidence that the next day is not an object noun phrase in this sentence because you can't make a passive. So therefore, the next day is an adverbial. Now we want to look at an example where the passive test shows us that the noun phrase following the main verb is an object. Using the verb left, past tense of leave, in the last example was a good one to use. Some of you might have thought it was pretty obvious that the next day was an adverbial in the last example, but for those of you who thought the noun phrase was an object, you might have been influenced by the fact that leave can be a transitive verb. Remember, lots of verbs can be intransitive or transitive. So let's look at an example of a transitive clause with the verb leave in it. My husband left the wine in the car. For now, I'm telling you that this is transitive, but it's good to know how to test that and how to know where the object noun phrase ends. So, is the wine the object of the clause? I need to make it clear here that with our 4 tests, is the noun phrase stating when, where, how or why? Can you leave the noun phrase out? And can you move the noun phrase to the front? Can you make a passive? If the noun phrase isn't an object but is an adverbial, then the answers will be yes, 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 and no. If the noun phrase is an object, not an adverbial, then the answers will be no, no, no or sometimes maybe, and yes. So, back to the sentence, my husband left the wine in the car. Is the noun phrase following the verb, the wine, an object noun phrase? Is the wine telling us when, where, how or why? No. Can you leave the wine out? Well, you could say my husband left in the car, but then that would mean that my husband left, not that he left the wine anywhere. Can you move the noun phrase to the front? The wine my husband left in the car. Well, that could sound okay in some contexts, so we better do the passive test as the best test. The wine was left in the car by my husband. Sounds perfect. Well, not so perfect if you wanted to have a drink, but perfectly grammatical. So yes, the wine is the object in this sentence. So this has been the last of our lectures on grammar for this course. We've got a few more lectures to go, but we've covered all of the basic points about grammar now. And we hope that you've all come to love grammar as much as we do. Well, maybe not quite love grammar, but you find that now you've got all of the information that you need to know about grammar in order to complete your case study. So if there are any points that you're still having trouble with, I recommend that you go back and review some of those lectures before your tutorials on the case study.